well. So yeah. Okay. Let me just make sure I have everything organized and ready for today. And we indeed do. It is time for history, indeed. History. Alright, so see some familiar faces, or I should say icons. So I think that's gonna probably be everyone, and I'm assuming that a good majority of people who were interested in the first place can't make it, but they are watching the recording. Okay, so welcome to A Push. We are starting Unit 5. If you want to know what the range is going to be 1844 to 1877, which does have some overlap with Unit 4, but that doesn't matter. In fact, we'll probably see some overlap with some content from Unit 4, but that should be fine. Okay, so today we're only covering half of the unit because it's a long unit. But before we start with content, just a few, preliminary stuff. Part of the Five Hive organization. Hopefully you guys have already heard of Five Hive. I've been doing these lectures for a while. If you want to join us, check out the document. Applications are reviewed on a rolling basis. So yeah, here's the feedback link. If you guys would like to fill that out, that would be much appreciated. This will pop back up at the end. But if you do want to do it now, here's also the QR code as well. Okay. And finally, our usual disclaimer. AP is a trademark by College Board. We are not affiliated with College Board, and College Board doesn't endorse us. So yeah. And as usual, be respectful. The lecture is recorded, so you don't have to stay throughout. You can watch the recording, which I will post as soon as I can. These slides will be posted on Friday when I finish Unit 5. So yeah. And here's the agenda for today. We're only covering 5 topics. There's actually 10 topics, so it's evenly divided. So we'll probably focus a little bit more on activities. Per se. Yeah. So, before I start, any questions about, how the lecture's going to go, the formatting, anything? Most of you, well, not most, but some of you guys know what the usual procedure is. I yap, activity, yap again, activity, rinse and repeat until we reach the end. The recorded lectures are going to be found in the lecture calendar and announcements. So look for Lance's last announcement, and then there should be a hyperlink over lecture calendar, and there you can find our schedule for the lecture, slides, as well as recordings, and you can also see who and when. So yeah, good information on that, as usual. Long-term effects of the Mexican-American War. We are going to talk about more so the immediate effects of the Mexican-American War. It's both going to look at political as well as a little bit on social effects. Although the social effects of the Mexican-American War are fairly straightforward. And we'll discuss that when we are in 5.3. I'll take that question as a sign that we are good to go, and let's jump into the content. So, Manifest Destiny. I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys have heard about it. If not, it's a thing. So, let's talk about Manifest Destiny. Why Manifest Destiny? First of all, before I actually just talk about why Manifest Destiny, we should probably define Manifest Destiny as the belief that Americans have this preordained fate to occupy this continent, to spread from sea to shining sea. That's the key phrase here. And also note that I use the phrase preordained fate or preordained destiny. So there's that. What it is just westward expansion. That's about it. So why we choose to expand west? Well, it's the same reasons as, throughout units 1 through 4. We run out of land, we want more land. Maybe we want to look for more natural resources out west. But a new kind of reason does pop up here, and it's called religious freedom. And this pops up mainly for one group of people. And you guys probably can guess who it is. It's the Mormons. A bunch of Mormons will migrate from the Midwest area, and that somewhere close to there. And they're going to go over to Utah, modern-day Utah. Why? Well, they were shunned for their one belief that they are so infamous or famous, I don't know, well known for, and it's polygamy. So they're going to settle in Utah, which is west, right? And they're going to, establish their own Mormon communities and all that. Another thing about this is that now we've got economic, in some ways you can argue natural resources economic, but genuinely economic opportunities that people were striving for. You also had the backup of the federal government in terms of legislation. So let's talk about the economic first. Gold rush. Now the gold rush is going to be after, when we get California. A lot of people associate the gold rush with modern day California, but the gold rush really just encompasses a good chunk of the West Coast. Now the gold rush in general will attract people who will make their stakes, believing that they'll strike it rich with natural resources, specifically gold. Another thing that will also mainly push settlers west is going to be the Panic of 1837. Now recall that the Panic of 1837 is a direct effect of the bank war from Andrew Jackson, right? All the pet banks, they can't do crap. They're not going to be able to keep the economy afloat because it's just not good policy. That was the national bank's job. And when you don't have a national bank to do that, economy equals bad. So the Panic of 1837, which will mainly affect the North for the most part, will push, and the West, for the most part, will push settlers west. Again, for the same kind of economic opportunities, maybe for natural resources, maybe for homesteading. And this kind of settlement, this Western settlement, is going to be well supported by legislation. We've already mentioned the Indian Removal Act of 1830. That mainly benefited the South, right? The western area closest to the South. But I think one piece of legislation that is quite important is going to be the Preemption Act of 1841. And what that piece of legislation does, by the way, you don't need to know it specifically, but it is a good piece of evidence regarding the federal government's support for Western expansion. Anyways, what that legislation does is that it permits people to buy land directly from the government before the government offers or, chooses to sell the land to the public. So if you were a squatter and you were there already, you had the option to purchase land from the government. And if you're a Western settler, that was amazing. But that also meant that you had to race out west to find your own stake of land. So there was also a sense of urgency behind this. Now let's talk about the ideology of Manifest Destiny. And yes, there is ideology behind it. Mainly three kind of components: moral virtue, spread of republicanism, and faith in destiny. A lot of historians will look at Manifest Destiny as the first kind of spur of American imperialism. Some historians will look at it through the light of American exceptionalism, romantic nationalism, or white nationalism. For now, you don't need to care about those three or what historians look at, but do know that throughout Manifest Destiny, there's going to be a religious component behind it. The idea that God is behind America and that it is America's mission and if it to settle out west, and occupy a good chunk of the continent from sea to shining sea, right? Manifest Destiny will be coined by John O'Sullivan, who will, again, I think his words summarize this idea of manifest destiny quite well. It is preordained. And you can look up that source if you want to. Another big proponent is going to be a president, James K. Polk, and he will only serve one term. Before we talk about James K. Polk, we will probably ignore James K. Polk until literally the next topic, which is literally probably the most important thing during his presidency. We will talk about territorial gains later as well, because I feel like it. And also, it feels more appropriate because the territorial gains were most certainly under James K. Polk. In fact, the most significant gains were under James K. Polk, aside from Texas. But technically, Texas is just James K. Polk because he completed the whole deal. Now, the third part about this is a little strange. College Board chooses to include it, so I'll just mention it, but I don't think it's particularly the most important. While Americans settled west, they will have initiatives, diplomatic initiatives with Asian countries, specifically China and Japan. So for China, the U.S. is going to hop on the sphere of influence train that Britain, France, and all those European countries are going to be doing. They're going to sign the Treaty of Wangxia in 1844. And basically, the premises of the treaty is going to grant the U.S. the most favored nation status. Basically, it benefits the U.S. economically. They're going to agree to give the United States some treaty ports and permit them to build any kind of churches on there. And also, I did include this funny provision in my notes, the right to Chinese, which is quite interesting because that just means that American diplomats have the right to learn Mandarin. But that last part is not important. Just know that they wanted to engage trade with China and they wanted to have economic advantage as well in that domain. As for Japan, I think a lot of world history people will remember this. The Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854 will force Japan to open up its borders. It's going to open trade, and it's going to rip Japan out of the Sakoku period. Again, another instance of the U.S. forcing trade, not forcing trade, but, well, in this case, it is forcing trade down Japan's throat. But the U.S. will engage in trade negotiations with Asian countries as they reach the Pacific Ocean. Any questions so far about that? Is the Manifest Destiny linked with the Monroe Doctrine? Not particularly. No. The key principle behind Manifest Destiny is a religious idea, and the religious idea being that this is a God-given mission. If you know anything about American history so far at this point, religion has been a strong motivator among Americans. So that's the key point that Manifest Destiny circles around. It is not a new phenomenon either, westward expansion. It is sort of a redefinition or re-transformation of ideology in some ways. Someone asked act of what, but I'm not quite sure of what they were. Why was religion such a big player? That's a very good question. Unfortunately, that's a question you have to ask Americans, because I am not much of a religious man. But a big thing to talk about is that the religion has been well ingrained in American society, for the most part. I mean, we had Puritans, we had a good chunk of Protestants. We had 2 Great Awakenings, and we're gonna actually see a lot more Great Awakenings, but not they won't be mentioned explicitly. For some apparent reason, Christianity seems to be a very strong enforcer throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. And also the idea of Christianity, there was an idea of agnosticism or anything like that. Most Americans were Christian, that is correct. And there was no kind of idea of agnosticism. Either you were something else entirely or you were Christian in the minds of Americans. So yeah, religion will be a very important part. Sunday masses and all that is going to be ingrained in the cultural zeitgeist of Americans. For the most part. Manifest Destiny will accelerate sectional tensions. We will actually get to that. We will explain why later. So if you wanted to follow up with a why question, 5.5. That's where we talk about sectional tensions. But in brief, the North, not a fan of it. The South loved it. It's 36-30. That's the line. And also the 50-50 rule is the balance of states. Again, we're gonna get to that. You guys are jumping. You're putting the cart. You're putting the cart before the horse. We need to talk about the Mexican American, not revolution, before we get to the actually important stuff. No, 50-50 rule of the Senate. Basically, someone is referring to the idea that we need to balance free states and slave states, mainly because of the Senate. We'll get to that. I'll explain it in more detail. First, let's do a quick MCQ about this. So, yeah, which of the following best describes the reasons that Americans... That was not a well-written sentence. I'm sorry. That's not grammatically correct. Reasons that Americans settled west during Manifest Destiny. So, I'll give you guys a minute to look through the choices and make your choice. What do you think is the best answer to this? Again, best doesn't mean it's the most awesome response. People can write certainly better responses. That's how the APUSH MCQs work, though. I'm giving you guys 1 minute because, yeah, MCQs are usually done in 1 minute. Okay, it's been 1 minute. So I'm going to look through the responses right now. So a good chunk of you guys have said A. So anyone who picked A, would you like to explain your answer choice? So A has responded because they seeked to expand religion. Syria has said because of the gold rush. Anyone else has their 2 cents? Process of elimination, as always, is a good method. Obviously, I mentioned B, that Monroe Doctrine didn't really have anything to do with Manifest Destiny. You just analyze the distractors. That's always something you should do with distractors, if you do process of elimination and all that. So A is the correct answer, yes. God-given right to expand territory, religious freedom. Gold rush is an example of economic opportunities. Basically, these are just the 3 ideas. Some of the more important ideas behind Manifest Destiny, right? Economic opportunity, religion. Natural resources could technically fall under economic opportunity. Okay. So good. Now we understand Manifest Destiny. Let's talk about what Polk did. So this topic, even though it says Mexican-American War, I'm just gonna call it the Polk slide. So there's gonna be some stuff not on this slide, so that Polk did, but should be things that you guys should understand. So James K. Polk, when did he come into office? 1844. I already mentioned it. Well, he won the election in 1844. He officially entered office in 1845, but that doesn't matter. Polk ran on four campaign goals. One was reduce tariffs. Two, it was to reestablish an independent treasury system. Three, Oregon Treaty and not Oregon Treaty. He wanted to get Oregon. He also wanted to get a bunch of land, including California. So those last two, Oregon and California, I just group into Manifest Destiny, because they both mean expansion. So let's talk about Oregon. What did he do for Oregon? In 1846, he signs a treaty with the British, who, are still in Canada. And you know where Canada is? Well, it's literally on the border of modern-day Oregon. So you can imagine that Oregon Territory is going to probably be a contentious issue between the British and the Americans for a variety of reasons. But the most significant that you have to know is that the British were fur trading there and the Americans were settling there. Both wanted it. They both had their own claims. So what they will do is they will negotiate the Oregon Treaty. And what that does is just going to split Oregon along a parallel line, quote unquote. And that's where we get our modern day border with the Oregon country, or the Oregon Territory. As for the reduced tariffs and reestablish the treasury system, by the way, Congress did that very quickly. It's not something that he had a big role in. Now, aside from Oregon, we also have to address the time we beat up the Mexicans. That's going to be really out of context. So before we talk about the time we went into the Mexican Empire in Mexico City and, declared our second war as an independent country, we're going to have to talk about Texas, because it's Texas' fault. The tension in Texas comes from the fact that American settlers were invited by Mexico to settle in modern-day Texas. The issue is with this settlement from Americans is that they mainly came from the South. And the Mexicans had their own set of laws. And these are regulatory laws. Basically, they required all settlers in Texas to become a Mexican citizen, to convert to Roman Catholicism, and to do everything they did in Spanish, and to not own slaves. Now, obviously, with Protestant American Southerners, they're not going to do any of that. Number one, because they want to stay American. Number two, they're Protestant and they hate Catholics. Number three, they speak English and English only. And number four, slaves. And that last part, slaves, is a key point, because eventually, when we have a change in leadership in the Mexican government, they want to enforce those laws. So they're going to send a certain general, Santa Anna, to Texas to enforce those laws. Of course, Texas is going to not, concede. And basically, they effectively declare like a revolt. Basically, the Texan War of Independence. Probably the most famous battle that comes out of that is going to be Alamo in 1836. Americans die in that battle, like absolutely everyone will die. But the Texans are going to rally behind, remember the Alamo, and eventually they will win at the Battle of San Jacinto in 1836. And after that, the Mexicans will sign a treaty. Technically, they didn't, but the Mexicans will concede, and Texas will officially become its own republic for around 9 years until its annexation in 1845. Now, Texas, when they became independent in 1836, they wanted to be part of the Union in America. The thing is, leadership did not want to do that, mainly because they didn't want to go to war with Mexico for a variety of reasons. It could be very damaging politically, but also economically, it's just war is not ideal. So Jackson is not going to allow annexation. Martin Van Buren, his successor, is not going to allow annexation. And John Tyler, who is going to be the president before Polk, will refuse annexation until last minute. He will start the process of annexation, but the Senate will block that. But they will gain enough steam to officially annex Texas in 1845 because of Polk's election. Polk's campaign on Manifest Destiny was very popular among the American people as a whole. Not everyone, but just people as a whole. So John Tyler's going to look at this and think, oh, I want to cement my presidential legacy. And so he starts the whole process with annexation, but officially it's finalized under Polk's administration. Now, one key issue with the annexation of Texas, border disputes. The Mexicans and the Americans will not agree on where the border of Texas will be. The Americans will demand, oh, it's going to be on the Rio Grande River. The Mexicans will say, no, that's too much land for you guys. And so what the Americans will do is they're going to respond to that with violence. They're going to send troops to the Rio Grande, and eventually we'll get a border conflict there, a border fight. And that officially kicks off the Mexican-American War. Now, the idea of California and Mexican cession was before the Mexican-American War. In fact, the Americans actually sent diplomats over to ask Mexico to give them California. Obviously, the Mexicans will say no, and that translates to roughly no from Spanish to English. And then they will respond with the Rio Grande dispute. That battle happens. And then Polk will convince Congress to declare war on the Mexicans because Americans twisted this story that, oh, it was the Mexicans who attacked us. And apparently Congress took the bait. So we go into Mexico in 1846, and we will come out on top in 1848. So what does the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo dictate from the Mexican-American War? We settle the Rio Grande border. The border of Texas will be at the Rio Grande River. Mexico will sell us its land, Mexican cession, in 1848, right? That includes California, New Mexico, and Utah territories. And we will have this little sliver that I included here that will remain part of Mexico, but eventually we come to purchase it. The Gadsden Purchase in 1853. Why we purchased it, that's not particularly important. It has to do with railroads. Very boring. So we pretty much just reached almost our full actual size, modern day borders, size from the Gadsden Purchase, Hawaii, and Alaska, and a bunch of territories. But we will get to that after the Civil War. Now, during the Mexican-American War, we had some opposition, particularly the Whigs and the Free Soilers, and we're going to talk about the Free Soilers in more detail when we discuss 5.4 and 5.5. So, what will the Whigs do during this Mexican-American War? They're actually going to propose an amendment. It's going to be called the Wilmot Proviso, again, at the beginning of the war, so 1846. And what the Wilmot Proviso was supposed to do was effectively ban slavery in new territories. Obviously, Southerners don't like that at all. So this reveals sectional tensions between the Whigs and, well, mainly Northern Whigs and mainly Southerner Democrats. The South and the North are going to have a very bitter dispute over this Wilmot Proviso, and it's going to eventually fail in the Senate. As for non-Americans during the war and after the war, when we say non-Americans in this particular topic, we're mainly focused on Mexicans and Native Americans. We already addressed the slavery issue with African Americans. So, what did Mexicans and Native Americans face after the Mexican-American War? Well, The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo forced America to guarantee Mexicans citizenship. So there's that. There's a benefit for the Californios in California, but they are actually going to face voter discrimination. They are going to lose their social status as well in that area. As for Native Americans, they had it worse. Loss of citizenship, straight up genocide, such as the Sand Creek Massacre and the California genocides, as well as being forced onto reservations. So the continued story of Native Americans being treated like crap by the American government remains true, which is an unfortunate story to keep on telling over and over, but you guys will see the pattern that it's a continuity throughout American history. So that's about it about the Mexican-American War. Zachary Taylor will rise as a war hero. He was, in fact, one of the commanders involved at the Rio Grande border dispute. Yes. Any more questions about Mexican-American War? Other than sectional tensions, because that will be the next two topics. How we will address it. The Wilmot Proviso will fail in the Senate because it was extremely unpopular among Southerners. They saw any attempt at banning slavery, not even slavery in their land, but slavery in new territories, as an existential threat to slavery, which they believed to be a positive good and a constitutional right. So that mainly fails in the Senate. I don't remember off the top of my head whether or not it passed in the House. But do know that it failed, but it was kind of one of the things that started to reveal very strong sectional tension over slavery. In fact, it's probably the first step in the road down to the Civil War regarding slavery. Before, sectional tension was over the economy and slavery. Now, it just really becomes the focus on slavery. All right. Looks like we don't have any questions, so let's get to the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. Probably one of the most important aftermath. Let me just check if there are any questions. Nope. A Compromise of 1850. So, what was the Compromise of 1850 all about? Well, it had to deal with the new territories. We had to deal with California, New Mexico, and Utah. The issue is with all this new territories, well, California was actually big enough and satisfied all the requirements to become a new state. And so California is going to apply to become a new state. As usual, this strikes a very tense debate between Southerners and Northerners for the most part. This upsets the balance of the North versus slave states in Congress. And the reason why Southerners will be why the Southerners are going to whine a lot about this is because, well, they see that they need to keep this balance, particularly in the Senate. They couldn't care less about the House. In fact, the majority of Americans lived in northern states, right? Big urban centers. So the North, for the most part, dominated the House. But for the Senate, well, 2 senators per state. If there's one more free state, the free states have the majority in the Senate. And that is not a good thing for the southern states. So they're going to fight California's admission. And this will bring back up ideals again between North and South. So let's do a quick recap about what the Southerners, the Northerners, and abolitionists, and what the Northerners and branches of the Northerners believe in regards to slavery. Southerners regarded slavery as a constitutional right. They believed that the Constitution had to protect slavery and states' rights. Now, the Northerners, they don't like slavery. But the Northerners will be divided up into 2 groups, the abolitionists and the Free Soil movement. So now I'm going to explain what the Free Soil movement is. Basically, Free Soil movement consisted of free laborers in the North who viewed slavery as a threat. to the free labor market. But that doesn't mean that they wanted to ban slavery throughout the US. No. They only wanted to make sure that there was no slavery in new territories so that the free labor market has an advantage in those new territories. Now, the abolitionists, on the other hand, no slavery, period. Absolutely none at all. So that's the summary of their ideals in the debate. Obviously, Henry Clay is going to represent the Northerners as the great compromiser. Northerners and Westerners, technically. And John C. Calhoun is going to be the representative, the great nullifier, as we call him, for his role in the nullification crisis, for his defense of the Southerners. The reason why I bring up Daniel Webster and William Seward is that Daniel Webster will actually make an important speech about national unity, which we will analyze next, while William Seward will bring in the idea of all men created equal from the Declaration of Independence in this debate. Now, do you need to know what the contents of their debates or what their speeches are? Not exactly. But do understand that sectional conflict, regional conflict will rise and will be intensified, escalated throughout the debates of the Compromise of 1850. Now, let's get to the actual provisions of the Compromise. There are four provisions, four great, important provisions, not great. First one you need to know, Fugitive Slave Act. What did that dictate? Well, it required officials from every state, that included the northern states, to return slaves. Before the Compromise of 1850, one way that slaves escaped their own condition was to escape to the north. Now, this piece of legislation would force them to flee all the way to Canada, which was, for the most part, free. The British was very abolitionist and, in fact, banned slavery very early, actually. California will get admitted as a free state. Woohoo. But Utah and New Mexico will be established. Sorry, someone is in this room. Hold on. The territories of Utah and New Mexico will be left up to popular sovereignty. Now let me explain popular sovereignty. It's pretty much simple. It's in the name. But it's the basic idea that the condition of whether or not it's a slave state or a free state will depend on the votes of the people that live there. We will see why popular sovereignty will become an issue later on, when things blow up. And the fourth last thing, which is not really important, no slave trading in Washington, D.C. That's about it. So the big things you need to know is that are the Fugitive Slave Act and popular sovereignty in the New Mexico and Utah territories. California becoming a free state is not really the most important. The Missouri Compromise is not exactly going to be repealed. I don't know what you mean by updating the Missouri Compromise. Oh, I don't think he's in this lecture anymore. Any questions about the Compromise of 1850? Because we are going to look at a part of Daniel Webster's speech. No? Right. Fairly straightforward. Analysis. Hold on. Someone was typing. Yes, people in the northern states were forced to return slaves. Now, technically, they could just not do it, but they would be fined or punished. It was a law. Which is why it's called an act. Usually when you read into legislative history, acts are called. Save a human life or 5. It was relatively costly at the time. I don't remember the exact costs, but some state governments preferred to save the money over the lives. I know, pretty scummy, but a lot of Americans were pretty scummy in this time. And yes, if we account for inflation, $5 would still be pretty a lot. Anyways, that's besides the point. So, hopefully you guys haven't started reading, but if you have, that's okay. I don't really care. So the instructions, you will read, you will study, quote unquote. You will just read it. You will read this excerpt from Daniel Webster and respond to all four of the following parts. I decided to make this 12 minutes tops. So yeah. Please work on this because I want to make sure you guys are exercising or continuously exercising your historical writing and your historical thinking skills. As always, if you have any questions like spelling mistakes, actually this is a direct transcript, so there are going to be spelling mistakes compared to modern English. But yeah, any vocab, feel free to ask me. For the people watching on the recording, here's the full screen. Okay, any questions about the source? Any clarification is probably the most important question to ask. Looks like someone has finished. How are we looking on time? Do you think you need more than 12 minutes? You have 5 minutes left, around there. 6, actually. By the way, if you are finishing up your responses and you notice that you want to add something, feel free to let me know if you need more time to edit your response. Let's see. You guys have 3 minutes left. Any requests for an extension? God, I sound like a teacher saying that. You have a 2-day extension? No. We have 2 responses. Is anyone else working? Because I don't see anyone else typing. Unless you happen to be eating dinner at this point. Then that might Okay. So I'm assuming some of you guys are doing it in a separate doc. All right. That's good to know. That's good to know. A push on marks. Always fun. 1 minute left. So finish up your thought. Okay, it's time. Post your responses in the chat below. Or whatever. So, let's take a look at part A. Identify a key principle or idea behind Daniel Webster's speech. Let's take a look. Discussing the divide which is currently occurring between the South and the North regarding the ownership of slaves. And Webster's main idea is that he wants the Union to be preserved and not simply abandoned. He believed that slavery was morally wrong, but he still wanted to preserve the Union. Key principle behind the speech is to attempt to preserve the Union following divides over slavery. Yes, that is the key point in Webster's speech. Okay. Part B. Explain the context of the period prior to Daniel Webster's speech. So you had to contextualize this speech. Why did he yap like with this? So, before Webster's speech, the North and South had been discoursing about the right to own slaves, and the act which forced Northerners to send back escaped slaves was not well received, and many Northerners would instead go against the act. Politically speaking, the North and South were beefing over slaves, the new admitted states, on whether or not it should be a slave state, and the Fugitive Slave Act was put into places, but Northerners didn't like it. The North and South were divided over the issue of slavery. They were on the brink of civil war. Yes, political tension. And secession was almost a threat during the Compromise of 1850. Okay, Part C. Explain the reasons why Daniel Webster would make this speech in Congress. He made this speech to try and maintain the union with the South and stop the South and North from dividing from one another. He made this speech to unify the Union. Webster didn't want the nation to divide over slavery. His speech aimed to persuade them to stay. Yep. Pretty short sourcing there. Now, D. Explain how a historian would best use this source when writing about sectional conflict. Historians could use this source when writing about a sectional conflict to explain how some Northerners, although did not support the South, still wanted to maintain homogeneity and not have the USA split into two different countries or regions. I think historians would use this to explain that Northerners, although they somewhat cared for the slaves, they cared more about being in Union. Yes, that was a little brutal, brutally honest, but true. Historians can use this source to write about how the Union, despite being against the ideas of the South, didn't want them to separate. Yes, so one of the key things that we will discuss about the Civil War in the coming year, not coming year, in the coming Friday, in the next review session, is the reason for the war, the war goals, why are we fighting, and we will talk about that much later. But yes, the Union is going to be a key point illustrated by Daniel Webster. Any questions about the analysis part? By the way, the guy yaps for a long time. I tried to read through the entire thing. It's just not something you can do in the time I had to do it. Okay. Sectional conflict. All right. So, before we talk about sectional conflict first, let's talk about immigration. So immigration, for the most part, remember we talked about the Irish and German waves. We already mentioned why they came down to America, because Europe was stinky. No, the Irish had to face the Great Famine, and the Germans, well, if you've seen Germany in this point in time, then you don't want to live in Germany. Basically, too many city-states and all that. And smaller states, religion, all that. And then finally, the revolutions in 1848 will push Germans out, a good chunk of them out, to America. Also, starting in 1844 and going over to 1877, we start to see the beginning of Jewish, Chinese, and Filipino immigrants, but they are not going to be the same magnitude as that of Irish and German immigrants. We will discuss Chinese and Filipino immigrants in fuller detail when we discuss the Gilded Age. As for the Jewish immigrants, for some reason, College Board doesn't really talk about them a whole lot. But it is, we'll see a huge wave prior to World War II during the interwar years. But that's outside of the time frame for now. So, the big groups are the Irish and the Germans. In response to the immigration of Irish and Germans, we see the rise of the nativist movement. The nativists were interested in protecting native-born Americans against immigrants. They believed many things that current nativists believe, and the same nativists from the Gilded Age believed, is that, immigrants would be a threat to their society. Maybe they would also be a threat to their economy in some ways, or to their job market, etc. Now, the reasoning for this is just they didn't like Catholic Irish and non-Protestants. The Irish were predominantly Catholics, and the Germans, you had a very good chunk of Catholics in that group as well. The nativist movement is going to become so strong that they will form their own party, known as the Know Nothing Party. Why? Because they don't know anything. Well, that would be their response to a lot of things. But, I'm starting to think that they actually don't know anything at all. If you don't know how I feel about nativists, it's not a positive opinion. But the nativist movement will also make leeway. Not make leeway. I won't talk about the courts yet. But they will be involved in riots. They will... including the Philadelphia nativist riots in 1844. They're going to mainly happen in urban centers, nativist riots. In addition, they will try to they're going to try to use government to push these guys out. For example, People v. Hall, which is an absolute hilarious case name, in 1854 will basically tell Chinese immigrants off, basically saying that they're not citizens. Again, this is actually really early. It's before any of the Chinese Exclusion Act stuff, but we will talk about more details later because that's outside of a time frame. But the reason why I want to talk about immigration and nativism is that this was a thing that mainly happened in the North and the West. Northwest. Midwest, technically. Why? Again, urban centers, manufacturing attracted a lot of immigrants. And also the response to that was mainly rising among the urban centers. Now for the South, slaves. They didn't really have any immigrants there. Why? Because why would you want to live in the South? I mean, there's not many job markets there because the job market is non-existent in the South. Which leads us to kind of comparing their economies. Again, I mentioned free labor in the North and manufacturing. And I already mentioned that they opposed slavery because they viewed it as a threat to the free labor market. And again, the Free Soil Party movement, which will become its own party, had the idea that that we shouldn't have slavery in the new territories, again for the reason of the free labor market. Now, for the South, they had to rely on slavery because they were a plantation economy. The backbone of their anything was just cotton. And in the beginning of the colonies, it was, a variety of cash crops: indigo, rice, tobacco. Eventually, again, it transforms into cotton in Unit 4. But still, it's a plantation economy consistently. Now, I mentioned slavery becoming a very key issue among the regions, the North and the South. And that's because the abolitionists are going to cook. They're going to grow. They're going to become very vocal. And we're going to see more and more Northerners. Even though they are not going to be the majority of Northerners, we're going to see some more support and more sentiment and more kind of cooperation between the Free Soil and the abolitionists. And they will promote this abolitionist movement in a variety of ways. Or they will also further the cause in a variety of ways. So, as for supporting and growing the movement, they did publications and speeches. So, a written word and spoken word. So, for the publications, you should know The Liberator by William Lloyd Garrison. That's a very important abolitionist paper. You should also know The Significance of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which you can still read today. Why wouldn't you be able to read today? And the key principle behind Uncle Tom's Cabin was that it displayed, the gripping reality of being a slave in the South, which did end up turning a lot of Americans and a lot of Europeans as well to look at slavery as a moral evil. And that's where morality starts to become even more vocal. Remember when we talked about reform, religious people and reform groups will turn to moral justice as one of the reasons why they want to support abolitionism. As for speeches, for the most part, Frederick Douglass. We will also see activists as well, such as Sojourner Truth. Again, there's so many abolitionists and important people in that era that you shouldn't really be able to name every single one of them, but name the majority of a good chunk of them, not the majority of them. Now, as for activities they did that supported the abolitionist cause, they either helped slaves escape or violence. But probably the most important part is helping people escape, right? Most notably, the Underground Railroad and their conductors, including Harriet Tubman, will help slaves kind of not actually follow a literal railroad, but will follow kind of these checkpoints, these secret routes, and, these safe houses until they reach the North. But, of course, after the Fugitive Slave Act, they have to go all the way to Canada for that. As for the violence, John Brown. That's all you really need to know about violence. John Brown was pretty nuts. And we'll talk about the kinds of crazy stuff he did in the next topic. Now, again, I mentioned that abolitionists will turn to moral justice as the reason for banning slavery. What the pro-slavery people are going to argue is just blatantly disgusting. So, for example, they believe that slavery and states' rights should be protected by the Constitution. They also invoked racial doctrine, basically white superiority. Oh, we're white people and they're black people. We should enslave them and civilize them because we are the light and whatever and all that. Again, disgusting. And also they viewed slavery as a positive social good. Again, civilizing them, spreading Christianity, educating them, which in fact was not something they were doing. Again, the pro-slavery arguments are always disgusting, and they're going to remain the same throughout Unit 4 and Unit 5. Any questions about sectional conflicts? If you would like to speak, then type your question or your whatever. Mic was glitching. Lag? Oh. What did you guys miss when I was speaking, when the mic was going crazy? If you guys don't mind. Again, if you want to speak, type your chat. Oh, it was for 10 seconds. Did you guys think you missed anything important or something like that? Okay. Okay, sounds good. As long as you guys didn't miss any of the key takeaways. That's good. All right. Let's move on. Failure of compromise. So we do end up going into a civil war. Wow. Who would have expected? But for the most part, we've been trying to do these compromises. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850. Yeah, no, that's not going to happen anymore. So, our attempt at compromises will come from, again, government policies. But these government policies are going to lead to a lot of tension. So let's talk about two specifically. When I say government policy, that does include the Supreme Court, and you'll just make sure you guys understand that. So, first things. Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854. How did it start? Well, Stephen Douglas proposed the idea of splitting Kansas and Nebraska's territories and giving them popular sovereignty and all that. All for a goddamn transcontinental railroad. Anyways, his idea to bring in Kansas and Nebraska as territories, to organize, before it was unorganized territory, by the way, in order to organize them as Kansas and Nebraska, there was the issue of slavery again. And again, people are going to be very worked up about this whole slavery thing. They should be free. They should be slave states. And they're going to try to compromise with popular sovereignty. Now, here's the key problem with popular sovereignty. In this case, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise Agreement. Why? Well, it was a very real possibility that Kansas and Nebraska could become slave territories or slave states. In that case, that's above the 3630 North parallel line. So, there's that. We will talk about the effects of Kansas-Nebraska a little bit later when we talk about political violence and the rise of the Republican Party. But the other policy or the government action I want to talk about is the Dred Scott decision in 1857. Key premise. A slave, Dred Scott, was from Missouri, but his owner brings him to a free state in the Midwest, specifically Wisconsin, if I remember correctly. Dred Scott's going to sue his owner, Sanford, that he should be free because he's in a free state. So, in some ways, that makes sense. I would agree with that. I would take that. But the Supreme Court's going to, under Roger B. Taney, by the way, who was part of the spoils system from Andrew Jackson. So if you ask me why I hate Andrew Jackson, one of that is my reasons. Anyways, here's the argument that the Supreme Court provided when they said, no, you are not a free person. Okay. Since Dred Scott was property, he could not sue against Sanford. Again, dehumanizing. And since he was property, under the Constitution, the federal government could not take away slaves without due process. So what effectively happened after the Dred Scott decision was that it really just tore the abolitionist gains apart in the North. Slaves could be brought anywhere they wanted. And again, it further cemented the opposition of the North. very easily. But yeah, the Dred Scott decision pretty much reversed the condition of a lot of African Americans living in the North. Um, so, tension, stoking the fire. Now let's talk about the fire. Political violence. I want to talk about particularly three events. Bleeding Kansas was a particular kind of period of time in Kansas history from 1854 to 1861. How did it happen? Well, if you look at the map, Missouri's right next to Kansas. And when Missouri hears, oh, they have a popular sovereignty thing going on there, a bunch of Missourians, which we will call border ruffians because they are absolutely the worst, will move on over down there to Kansas territory in order to influence the vote. Now, the Free Soilers, they don't like that at all. So they are also going to move in as well. Now, the magnitude of Free Soilers versus the Border Ruffians is going to be very clear. Why? Well, at the time of the vote, we had 1,500 people. But when we counted the votes, we had 6,000 people voting. The only way this happened was because we had border ruffians from that border between Kansas and Missouri going in and voting and then going back to Missouri. So clearly it's fraudulent, right? I mean, that's scummy. So what's going to happen is, well, the Free Soilers and the abolitionists are going to say, no, you should not recount. No, they're not going to request a recount. But they are going to object to, this entire thing. And what effectively happens is that there's going to be establishment of two rival legislative bodies in Kansas. We're going to have the pro-slavery body established with the Lecompton Constitution, whose government, whose legislative body was centered in Lecompton, Kansas. And then we're going to have the anti-slavery legislative body centered in Lawrence, which is modern-day Topeka, established by the Topeka Constitution. Now, okay, why does this grow even worse? Well, the federal government effectively recognized the Lecompton government. Why? Because Franklin Pierce was president, and Franklin Pierce is an absolute scumbag. Again, more tension. The legitimacy between the anti-slavery and the pro-slavery government will lead to absolute violence between them. And what the pro-slavery guys are going to do is they're going to start doing violence as well. I'm pretty sure they're the ones that start the fire because, hey, they're the ones that, illegally went in and made illegal votes. And they're going to go down to Lawrence, modern-day Topeka, twice in 1856. And they're going to kill people. The sacking of Lawrence and the Potawatomi Massacre will both involve Lawrence. And it will both be perpetuated by pro-slavery people. Now, this news will reach a certain person that I mentioned before, and you guys probably know who it is. It's John Brown. What John Brown's going to do, he's going to go into Kansas, and he's going to go into Potawatomi Creek, which was a pro-slavery settlement in Kansas. He's going to take a man named James Doyle, who's a pro-slavery guy, his two sons, and he's going to execute them. And not by firing squad either. He's going to chop them up with an axe. So that's a nice detail to know. But this particular event, perpetuated by John Brown and the pro-slavery people in 1856, will kick off a series of violent events for 5 years. And the characteristics of these events are going to be the same as the sacking of Liuren and the Potawatomi Massacre and, these executions. Now, after this whole violence going on in 1856, Congress is shaken up. And what's going to happen is that Charles Sumner, who is an anti-slavery guy, is going to make a speech who's going to criticize Douglas and Butler and actually kind of will make a bit of a twist, a messed up move, which he makes fun of Butler after he has a stroke, which is not something you should really do. But he goes after a lot of these Southerner Southerners. And Butler's cousin, I think, first cousin, Preston Brooks, is going to hear what Charles Sumner says, and he's going to assault him with a cane. He actually ends up breaking that cane, so a bunch of Southerners will, praise him by sending him thousands of canes to replace it. Again, a sign of violence, not only within Kansas territory, but within Congress itself. In fact, it reached a point where Congress members started bringing weapons for self-defense. That's not a good sign in politics. And probably the last piece of violence is going to, again, involve our boy, John Brown, but this time it's going to lead to his death. I'm talking about the raid at Harper's Ferry in 1859. This is going to be the whole prelude to the whole Civil War thing going on. They initially intended to free a bunch of slaves in the South, but obviously that was put down and he was hanged. So there's that. Now, I talked about a lot of violence stuff, but something did also come out of all this violence. The collapse of the second party system. And the reason why is that the Whigs and the Democrats started to become split along regional lines for realsies now. The Whigs, particularly the Kansas-Nebraska Act, really messed up the Whigs. They split up into two camps, the conscious Whigs and the cotton Whigs. And hopefully you can make your best guess about what the cotton Whigs were all about. In addition, Northern Democrats who voted against the Kansas-Nebraska Act were absolutely furious about that regarding their own party. In fact, they're actually going to go out on their own way and found their own Free Soil Party, which will also involve our boy Martin Van Buren. Now, the split of the Whigs is not a good thing, but what will come out of that will be the brand new Republican Party. This coalition will involve of Northern Whigs and Democrats, Free Soilers, and abolitionists. Now, you should know the alignment of this new kind of third-party system. There's the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republicans had a big voting base in the North. They supported the manufacturing industries. They favored manufacturing. They also favored the idea of the free soil movement. The Democrats had their biggest base in the South. And actually, they didn't really gain too many people after the split of the Whigs and the Democrats. In fact, they probably suffered the most from it. Why? Well, those Northern Democrats are leaving for the Republican Party. They're not getting anyone else. But they will build a very strong base in the South. In fact, the majority of the South is going to stay Democrat for a very long time in American history. Now, that weakening will be a good setup for the election of 1860 and the kickoff of the Civil War. But I'm too tired and I don't feel like yapping too much. So I made this election of 1860 the beginning of Friday's review. So, with that said, any questions about... Yes, Charles Sumner was caned in Congress. I don't think Congress members assaulting each other is a good idea. Anyways, any questions about the flames that will hurl us into civil war after the election of 1860? I think it's fairly straightforward, hopefully. Is it? Yeah, I thought so. Civil War history is just... everyone knows what happens. Okay, cool. Now let's move on to something less fun. Because talking about violence is always fun, right? Anyways, I get to do that a lot in this A-Push class. We're going to do an SAQ. Now, what makes this SAQ a little different is that I chose to pick an SAQ that would be a little bit more cumulative. Which means you gotta pick out some stuff from Unit 3, Unit 4, and this unit. So, I will get, since this is a 4-part SAQ as well. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. I'll be giving you more time than usual. I usually give SAQs 10 minutes. This is going to be 12 minutes. Why? Because briefly described should take not too long. As always, any questions, feel free to ask me. But for now, I'm going to give you guys 3 minutes to think about your responses, and then you can ask your questions after that, which will be 6:24. For now, I have to leave this full screen for our people who are back at home watching the recording. Let's see. Pardon the coughing, by the way. I have not had water. As of now, how are we looking on time? Hopefully you are done with part A, and in the process of getting Part B a good response. Do Part B justice, guys. Alright, we're around the. I didn't start my timer in time, so I'm assuming we're like around 7 to 8 minutes into SAQ. Do we need more time? I guess we don't need more time. You guys have 1 minute left. Wrap up your thought, unless you guys want more time. You have 1 minute left to ask for more time. Okay, it is 6:33. Do you guys need more time? Looks like some people have responses. Still working on responses. So I think we're gonna have to expand the time. So maybe I'll give you guys maybe 3 minutes. 3 more minutes. I know Rimu's not the only one who's working on it, so. Read through your response. How are other people looking on all this? Basically done. Silver, are you working on this SAQ? Looks like Silver's not working on it. By the way, I apologize if you hear background noise.
There's nothing happening here.
Yeah, I apologize about that. Okay, I'm not sure where you guys are at. I know Rimu and Celia said that they're practically done. So I would appreciate if you guys start posting your responses now so we can take a look over them. Alright, let's walk through this together. Part A. Briefly describe one United States government policy from 1783 to 1840. So, the Fugitive Slave Act wanted Northerners to report and send back fugitive slaves back to the South. This is technically outside of the time frame. 1783 to 1840. This is a cumulative SAQ. Someone also mentioned the Missouri Compromise. Again, that's outside of the time. No, it's not really outside the time frame. It's 1820. Missouri Compromise, 1820. So let's see. Missouri Compromise allowed Missouri to join as a slave state and Maine to join as a free state to calm the tensions between the North and South. That is a government policy. Okay, Part B. Briefly explain one similarity or difference in how two groups responded to political change in the United States from 1783 to 1840. Let's see. Both the Federalist and Democratic Republicans organized new political parties. The Republican Democratic split into the Whig Party and the Democratic Party. My issue is this is not exactly explaining how two different groups are responding to political change. Let's look at a different response. Many Northerners opposed the compromise because it allowed slavery in Missouri, while many Southerners supported it because it maintained the balance of free and slave states in Congress. So the question was asking about political change. You had to look at a form of political change and a reaction to it. I'm not sure how you would interpret the Missouri Compromise as political change. Perhaps maybe the change in the makeup of Congress, but that is a little bit of a stretch. Part C. Briefly explain how one historical development from 1840 to 1860 contributed to regional divisions. This is the part. Now we're starting to look at Unit 5. The Kansas-Nebraska Act caused more regional division by the overturn of Missouri Compromise and Bleeding Kansas. I think it would have been more... Yes, the Kansas-Nebraska Act causes more regional division. The overturn... You need to explain a little bit more about the overturn of the Missouri Compromise and Bleeding Kansas and how that particularly entails regional division. Part C. Following the Mexican-American War and the annexation of Texas, there was a lot of divide over whether it should be a free or slave state. Yes, about the expansion of slavery, yes, but you also need to mention the North and the South explicitly in regards to that debate. Part D. Briefly explain how such regional divisions affected United States government policy from 1840 to 1877. Pretty much 1860 at this point because we haven't gone over 1860 to 1877, but that's Civil War and Reconstruction. So let's see. Stronger Fugitive Slave Act and California was admitted as free state. Utah and New Mexico had popular sovereignty on the decision of slavery. This doesn't... I think it would have been better for you to focus more on the Compromise of 1850, right, the Fugitive Slave Act, and the California as a free state, and explain how the split, the regional split led to that compromise. I think it would have been a better response. Someone else says the Dred Scott decision decided that slaves were property and didn't have rights, feeling more divided between the North and South because abolitionists didn't like that. So for part D, it was supposed to explain how regional divisions affected the government policy, not how a government policy affected regional division. Do some of you guys see why the slight issues with some of your responses? Now let me make it clear: you guys are hitting you guys are very close to good points. You guys are bringing up good arguments. The issue is it's either outside the time frame, or it's not quite there yet. You didn't really articulate, or you weren't as explicit with your explanation, or you misread the question, which happens every now and then. That's fine. All right. Sorry. Any questions on the SAQ? That was very rude of me. Excuse me. Anyways, any questions about the SAQ? This was from 2024. So the actual SAQ from 2024 is going to be the first 3 parts. The last part was something I added. I liked this MCQ because it was more cumulative, what we have so far, because we're pretty much in the middle of this whole thing. So it looks like we don't have any questions about the SAQ. So here's the question slide. Oops, forgot about that little dark tab there. We're not restarting at 5.2. But any questions about the contents of Unit 5 so far? Any clarification you might need for exams, anything like that? Here's the lecture feedback link as well as the QR code. We will not be doing a walkthrough through the CED. We're doing that on Friday when we finish up Unit 5, by the way. Why wouldn't Missouri Compromise be considered a political change? So when it says political change, we're more looking at political structures rather than a government policy. So the kind of distinction that College Board is making here is between the decision a government makes and between the structure, maybe like a political party or the beliefs of a political party. Anything that involves kind of the structuring of political parties. The Missouri Compromise won't necessarily lead to that kind of thing. Now, to look back on this, what kind of political change might we look at from 1783 to 1840? Political change might also involve franchisement, the right to vote, by the way. What your political rights are, the ways you can participate politically as well. Do you have a large forehead? No, I just have lecture. The point of these slides are actually pointers for me to know where I am going with the lecture. So that's it. It's not all off the top of my head. It takes something to pull that out of my head. Like some kind of stimulus, and then my neurons are activated and I think of something. That's how these lectures work. Actually, the lecture slides are It would be much better if I had like a note guide, because that's what my teacher would do. She would have very sparse like lecture slides, just like key topics and all that. And then in the lecture notes, you would just talk about whatever she was yapping about. But if you guys are not the biggest fan of that kind of method, I will be adding on kind of outlines and little questions to guide your thinking on each slide for every unit, starting off from unit 1, probably the week before the exam when I have more time, because I don't do a lot of, there's not going to be a lot of content to cover in unit 9. So that's, yeah. There is also a thing that I might have like an eidetic memory, but I never really tested it. So a good chunk of historians do have a pretty spectacular memory. So well, if you want to have if you want to average like, I don't know, 6 hours of sleep instead, then and take 9 classes a quarter, then go for it. I don't recommend it. Yeah, I thought so. It's not all sunshine and rainbow over here where I am, because it is almost dark. That's why. But anyways, for real, any questions about the exam, the content for Unit 5, or maybe content from Unit 1 through 5 in general? Again, we will finish up Unit 5 on Friday. Same time as usual, 5 p.m. Pacific or 8 p.m. Eastern. This unit is the period 1844 to 1877. The key point is the debates on slavery leading up to the Civil War, and then the aftermath of the Civil War, aka Reconstruction. Those are the framework we are looking at. What we covered in this lecture so far, we covered Western expansion and how the debates on slavery will further divide the country, and we established kind of the framework so that when we dive into the Civil War and the Reconstruction, we can get at least understand why the whole Civil War thing kicks off and why Reconstruction will still be contentious, and that will be in Friday. I'm about to finish this lecture, so what we covered was only westward expansion. I will finish up Unit 5 on Friday. We will pick up with the Civil War. It's not really huge. You don't need to know a whole lot about military history. You just need some government policy. It's like actually kind of a strange series of topics, but something I'm covering anyways, so yeah. Could I give you guys political cartoon questions? That's a good idea. I should be giving you guys more stimuli, or more visual stimuli. I wanted to do one, but it took me a while to look for the visual stuff I wanted to get. I think we will certainly get political cartoon questions. Definitely during the Gilded Age. I think we're definitely going to tackle that in the Gilded Age. Maybe parts of it went after the Gilded Age, so Unit 7. Yeah. Unit 6 and 7 will probably start looking at political cartoons. And that's a good point, political cartoons. I might have to cover that in my final exam tips session. How to tackle political cartoons. That's a good thing to ask. You love political cartoons. Always funny, gotta love myself some satire. Alright. Any more questions about the exam? Content that we have covered so far? Maybe the review sessions? Do not ask me what I did for homework, because my homework just got assigned this week. Don't do it. I did eat a sandwich. I was going to say, I did not eat a sandwich. I ate a croque monsieur. That's what I ate for lunch today. Okay. I think that's the end of A-Push questions. fancy. Not expensive here, but okay. I think that's the end with a push oriented questions. So in that case, before I stop the recording, um, I want to say thank you guys for sticking out until the end. It's not easy to stay through a 2 hour lecture, so I appreciate it. If you do need to go through the recording again, I will post it sometime today or tomorrow. We'll see when the recording will get processed. And that will always be on the lecture calendar. Slides will not be posted. They will be posted on Friday. Again, just a reminder. All right, let's stop the recording here.